The couple were found dead in their home in the West Los Angeles neighborhood of Brentwood. Los Angeles police say they discovered 2 bodies inside the home, although so far they have declined to confirm the identities. "I warned my parents beforehand. I feared that one day he would do something irredeemable. And then the ultimate horror actually happened." When Rob Reiner and his wife were found dead in their own home, the public called it an unimaginable shock. But for Jake Reiner, their eldest son, the tragedy was not entirely a surprise. It was the culmination of a series of red flags that had been flashing incessantly for years, only to be dismissed and ignored by his parents. Jake speaks of his younger brother in uncompromising terms. He calls Nick an out-of-control monster. He exposes how his parents were blindly indulgent in the face of Nick's senseless rages, from acts of vandalism to blatant insults directed at their yoga teacher. What followed was a spiral into darkness with no exit. Valuable items in the house began vanishing mysteriously, as if the home was being hollowed out in silence. What did Jake Reiner reveal about what happened behind the doors of that seemingly perfect family? Watch until the end of the video, because the final detail will truly send chills down your spine. As the night of December 17th fell over Los Angeles, thick with silence, Nick Reiner sat quietly behind the cold doors of a jail cell on one side of the city. At that same moment, on the other side of LA, Jake Reiner sat in the KCBS studio, his professional home for many years. The studio lights beamed down, exposing everything on Jake's face: a skeletal frame, eyes sunken from nights of insomnia, and an exhaustion that transcended ordinary work pressure. Jake sat straight before the lens, but his shoulders were rigid. "I've sat here through many long nights," he said slowly, "but there has never been a night as horrific as tonight." From that moment on, Jake Reiner stopped speaking as a journalist. "My childhood was not a fairy tale." From a very young age, Jake Reiner was framed into an inescapable role: the eldest son, a position synonymous with unconditional concession to his younger brother. Jake learned to compromise with Nick as a natural reflex. He gave up toys, space, and priority. Whenever resentment sparked, Mr. and Mrs. Reiner would extinguish it with a command in the name of love: "He's just little." That phrase became embedded in Jake's memory as a mandatory rule of life. Each time, he suppressed his emotions, packed away his feelings, and replied curtly, "I'm fine." In that house, Nick was the center of the universe. When Nick raged, the whole family revolved around soothing him. When Nick cried, the world stopped spinning. And Jake? He retreated into the shadows, honing silence as the price to pay to keep the environment from becoming chaotic. Rob and Michelle feared their child being hurt, and above all, they believed in a dangerous ideal: that love could fix anything broken. In the fury of his adolescence, Jake once screamed, "Stop spoiling him so much." But despite everything, his parents chose to side with Nick through an extreme form of love. They saw in Nick a small soul in need of saving, while Jake, to them, was an adult who didn't need worrying about. Every time Nick stumbled, they reached out their hands to pull him up. Jake stood by, witnessing his parents slowly exhaust themselves in an effort to tame a wild beast with caresses. He realized that such indulgence did not smooth Nick's edges. On the contrary, it sharpened them by the day. Jake recalls family yoga sessions in the early 2000s. While Jake and Rami struggled to sit still and focus, Nick was a disruptive force. In the middle of the quiet space, Nick intentionally turned the poses into grotesque acts to challenge the teacher's patience. He would nudge his sister Romy, only 3 years old at the time, make mocking noises whenever the teacher requested silence, and constantly hurl provocative glares at Jake. The breaking point came when Nick began attacking the teacher directly with an insolent attitude. He openly called her annoying and ugly. Finally, one day when she could take no more, the teacher requested a private meeting with the parents. Rob and Michelle could only look at their son with eyes full of extreme anxiety. After the exchange, they promised the teacher they would discipline Nick more strictly. But it didn't stop there. After the outbursts, Nick began a new cycle of psychological torment for the family, disappearing. He would often leave home without a word of goodbye. Each time, the Brentwood house went into red alert. Michelle spent sleepless nights, and Rob paced his office with heavy sighs. Meanwhile, Jake had to continuously contact the police on behalf of the family to search for his missing-for-days brother. Then, just as the family reached the brink of exhaustion from worry, Nick would suddenly reappear with a bright smile. "Hey everyone, is everything okay?" After being tortured by alternating cycles of hope and disappointment too many times, the family began to choose to simply ignore him. Then, as his brother entered his teens, the horror Jake had always feared took shape. One late afternoon upon returning home, he caught Nick sitting motionless before a pile of white powder. In that moment, Jake's reality shattered. Without a second of hesitation, his blood boiled. The anger accumulated over years of being the good son exploded. He lunged, grabbing his brother by the neck. "You bastard! Do you have any idea what you're doing? You're destroying this family!" He didn't give Nick time to recover or explain. Jake grabbed his brother's collar, dragged the teenager, who was lethargic from hallucinations, across the floor, and threw him down in front of their parents. Faced with the evidence of the unopened powder, Rob and Michelle were so stunned they were speechless. Their son was involved in drugs. After the initial terror, they decided on a final solution, demanding Nick enter an inpatient rehab facility. But Nick, in his hallucinatory state, began to resist violently. He looked at his family with eyes full of hatred, then threw himself on the ground, writhing frantically. "Fine, have it your way." That very night, before anyone could catch their breath, Nick packed a few personal items and vanished into the shadows of Los Angeles. Nick had run away, leaving behind a vast void and a terrifying fear. From now on, they would no longer know what they were up against out there. And just when Jake thought the family would start a new life without his brother, another surprise occurred. Nick suddenly returned. He appeared at the door looking homeless, crumpled clothes, scraggly beard, and filthy hair. Nick stood there, shivering under the porch light. As soon as he saw Rob and Michelle, he collapsed to his knees, clutching his parents' legs and sobbing, "I was wrong!" Seeing their youngest son in such a pathetic state, Rob and Michelle's hearts tightened once more. All the resolve they had tried to build during Nick's absence vanished instantly. They rushed to pick him up, comforting him and believing that after a long time living on the streets, Nick had finally woken up. Shortly after, Rob arranged a screenwriting job for Nick as a way to introduce him to Hollywood. Nick accepted the deal, went back to work, and began earning money like a normal person. However, Jake sensed a different atmosphere permeating the hallways of the Brentwood home. He began noticing unusual details. An antique began to disappear. Luxury jewelry was no longer in its place, and even checkbooks in the desk drawer were clumsily rummaged through. Nick frequently walked through the house with shifty eyes, like a stranger scouting the blueprint of a treasure trove. Feeling a chill run down his spine, Jake pulled his parents into a private room, his voice low but sharp. "I'm not kidding. He's gonna strip this house clean." He pointed out every missing item, the signs that Nick was sneaking around at night. But Rob and Michelle's reaction was one of immense fatigue. Rob waved his hand slightly, his face radiating kindness. "You're being too sensitive, Jake." Michelle looked at him with gentle eyes. "Jake, he's your brother. Don't look at him like he's a thief." Jake stood frozen in the middle of the living room, watching his parents turn back to comfort Nick, while